The wind off the Gulf came in low and sideways that morning, carrying salt and diesel and the faint smell of something burning far out on the water. Crane Platform 7 sat 11 miles offshore, a converted naval contractor research installation bolted to a concrete deck the size of a city block, surrounded by nothing but gray water and gray sky. It had no official name anymore, just a designation in DoD contractor files, CP7. The workers called it the rig, though it wasn't that either. It was something stranger. A hybrid facility, half research station, half mechanical proving ground, built to test advanced marine propulsion systems under conditions no landlocked lab could replicate. The main engine hall occupied the center of the structure. 3 stories of reinforced steel, climate-controlled to within a single degree, home to a propulsion prototype that had no commercial equivalent on Earth. The system, internally designated Delphi, ran on a closed-loop thermoelectric architecture that the original design team had spent 6 years building. It was, by any measure, a masterpiece of applied engineering. It was also, at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, making a sound it should not have been making, a low, cycling hum. Just slightly out of rhythm, like a clock that had lost half a second per hour and hadn't been noticed for weeks. Ethan Calloway noticed. He was in the northeast corridor of the engine hall, lying half under a secondary coolant coupling with a flashlight between his teeth and a calibration wrench in his right hand, when he heard it. He stopped moving, listened. The hum cycled again low, almost subliminal. A quarter beat off its normal resonance pattern. Ethan pulled himself out from under the coupling and sat up on the concrete floor. He was 38 years old, lean in the way that comes from physical work rather than exercise, with grease-darkened hands and a hairline scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He wore no identification badge. He had been working at CP7 for 7 months, under the name and credentials of a standard maintenance technician, Class B certification, Level 2 clearance. Nothing remarkable on paper. He set down the wrench and pressed 2 fingers against the floor, feeling the vibration. There it was. Asymmetric pressure distribution in the primary thermal exchange loop. The signature was distinctive if you knew what to feel for. Most people didn't. He stood up and walked to the main monitoring panel along the south wall. The readings looked fine. Every gauge nominal. Every sensor within acceptable range. That was the problem. They shouldn't have been nominal, if the sound was what he thought it was. The sensors were reading the wrong thing entirely, or the calibration thresholds had been set incorrectly from the beginning, and no one had caught it. He pulled out his work log and made 3 quick notes, then flagged the entry for supervisory review. Procedure. He'd done this before on smaller issues, flagged anomalies, waited for the sign-off process, watched the issue get corrected within 48 hours. The system worked, if you trusted it. He was about to return to the coolant coupling when the door at the far end of the hall opened. Victoria Hargrove walked fast. She always walked fast. It was one of the first things anyone noticed about her heels on concrete, deliberate and even, like a metronome set to a pace that said she had already decided the outcome of whatever conversation she was walking toward. She was 29 years old. She had taken over as executive director of Hargrove Systems International 4 months ago, following her father's cardiac event and subsequent recovery leave. The company held the prime contractor position on the Delphi project, a $600 million DoD contract that her father had spent a decade cultivating. She had not built the Delphi project. She had inherited it. This distinction mattered to no one around her, more than it mattered to her. Behind her came Marcus Price, her operations director, a broad man with a careful face who had survived 3 corporate transitions by being agreeable to whoever was currently holding authority. And behind him, a cluster of senior engineers who had learned, in the past 4 months, that staying close to Victoria was usually smarter than staying away. She stopped 10 feet from Ethan. He hadn't moved. "Calloway," she said. "Miss Hargrove, you flagged a systems anomaly at 7-9. "Yes." She glanced at the monitoring panel. "Readings are nominal. The readings are incorrect." The word incorrect landed in the hall with a particular kind of weight. One of the engineers shifted slightly. Victoria tilted her head. "Explain." "The primary thermal loop is running asymmetric pressure distribution. The sensors are calibrated to a tolerance range that was set during initial installation. I believe the range is wrong, it's masking a real deviation. You believe? Yes. You have a Class B certification and 2 years of general maintenance experience, she said. And her voice was not cruel. Exactly, it was simply precise in a way that left no room for softness. The engineers who calibrated this system have combined doctoral-level experience in thermoelectric architecture that totals over 40 years. You're telling me they set the tolerance range wrong. I'm telling you the system sounds wrong. A beat. It sounds wrong, she repeated. Someone near the back of the group made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. Ethan said nothing. Victoria looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she looked at Marcus. Pull his file. I want a full review of his certification records and his maintenance log for the past 6 months. She turned back to Ethan. In the meantime, you're off active floor duty pending that review. If you pull me off the floor, that wasn't a request. He stopped, looked at the monitoring panel. Looked at her. If this system overheats, he said, very quietly, don't restart it. Not under any circumstance. Let it cool completely before attempting a manual reset. I'll take your input under advisement, she said. And then, because she was thorough, actually, don't bother with the review. Calloway, you're terminated. Collect your personal items and report to the dock transport by 0800. You'll be escorted to shore. She said it the way she said everything, even. Fast, final. She had already turned back toward the monitoring panel when Marcus touched her elbow and said, quietly, Victoria. He doesn't have a badge on. His access credentials. Deal with it, she said. Ethan picked up his flashlight and his wrench. He set them both on the secondary workbench with the same careful precision he used for everything. He unclipped his tool belt and folded it once and set it beside them. He pulled off his work gloves. He wiped his hands on the cloth he kept in his back pocket. 3 slow passes. Methodical, and then folded the cloth and set it on top of the tool belt. He looked at the monitoring panel one more time. The hum was still there. Nobody else seemed to hear it. He walked out. Outside, in the parking structure that served as the platform's equipment staging area, his truck sat in the 3rd row. It was a 2009 Ford F-250, dark blue, with a dent in the rear quarter panel that he'd never gotten around to fixing, and a passenger seat that had a booster cushion still strapped to it. His daughter was sitting on the running board. Lily Calloway was 9 years old, small for her age, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's habit of going very still when she was thinking hard about something. She had her backpack on her lap, and she was reading a thick paperback with a library sticker on the spine. She looked up when she heard his boots on the deck. You're done early, she said. Change of plans. She studied his face. She was very good at reading his face. Most adults weren't, but she had been doing it since she was 4 years old, and she'd gotten exceptionally good at it. Dad, she said. Are you in trouble? He crouched down in front of her so they were eye level. No, he said. You look like you're in trouble. I look like a man who got fired before breakfast, he said. That's different. She processed this. What are we going to do? I'm going to get you to school. Then I'm going to get breakfast. Then I'm going to figure out the rest. That's not a very detailed plan. No, he agreed. It isn't. He helped her into the passenger seat. She buckled herself in without being asked, and opened her book again. He started the truck. Through the windshield, across the platform's main deck, he could see the lights in the engine hall steady green. All nominal. No alarms. He pulled out of the parking structure toward the loading dock. Behind him, the engine hall hummed, just slightly off rhythm. The morning progressed the way mornings do when something is quietly going wrong but the metrics haven't caught up to it yet. Victoria Hargrove spent the first 40 minutes after Ethan's departure in back-to-back briefings with the project's DoD liaison, a soft-voiced man named Garrett Oakes, who wore the permanent expression of someone who had been told to keep his concerns proportionate. They discussed quarterly milestones, the upcoming Phase 3 demonstration, and the tentative date for the Navy's Technical Review Board 42 days out. She did not mention the anomaly flag. It had been cleared from the active log at her direction. The system was nominal. There was nothing to report. In the engine hall, Senior Engineer Douglas Freed ran the standard morning diagnostic and got exactly what the monitors showed him. Nominal readings across all parameters. He noted the clean numbers in the day log and moved on to the Phase 3 prep checklist, which was substantial and would take the better part of the morning. At 9:07, a junior technician named Amber Walsh noticed that the secondary coolant flow indicator had developed a slight oscillation, a small rhythmic tick in the readout that wasn't there before. She mentioned it to Freed. He looked at it. "Sensor variance," he said. "It happens when the platform rocks. Note it and move on." She noted it. She moved on. At 9:34, the oscillation had spread to 2 additional gauges. At 9:51, the hum that Ethan Calloway had heard at 7:09 became audible to anyone standing within 20 feet of the primary exchange housing. By 10, Douglas Freed had pulled his entire team off their prep work and gathered them in front of the main monitoring panel. Every reading was still nominal. Every alarm indicator was still green, but the sound had changed. It was lower now. Deeper. Less like a hum, and more like a pressure building behind a closed door. "Someone tell me what that is," Freed said. No one could. Victoria was in her office, a glass-walled room overlooking the main deck, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He had learned, over 4 months, exactly how to enter a room to tell her something she didn't want to hear. He did it slowly, with his hands visible, like a man approaching a dog he wasn't sure about. "We have a situation in the engine hall," he said. She looked up from her laptop. "The propulsion system," he said. "The sound Calloway mentioned, it's become significant. Freed's team can't identify the source. They're requesting a system pause for manual inspection. 42 days to the technical review." "I know. A system pause means a minimum 48-hour diagnostic cycle, then sign-off from DoD liaison before we can restart. We'd be cutting the Phase 3 prep window to the bone." "I know," Marcus said again. Victoria stood up. She walked to the window. Below, she could see 2 technicians hurrying across the main deck toward the engine hall, not running, but moving with the kind of urgency that people use when they're trying not to look panicked. "What's Freed's read on risk?" Marcus hesitated. "1 second. 2, he said, and I'm quoting, "I don't know what this is." "And that's the problem." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell him to run a manual override check on the thermal exchange loop. If the readings don't clear in 30 minutes, we'll consider a diagnostic pause. And if something happens in those 30 minutes, she looked at him, then we'll deal with it." He left. She stayed at the window. Below her, the main deck was quiet. The Gulf was flat and gray and enormous. 42 days. At 10:19, Douglas Freed initiated the manual override check on the thermal exchange loop. At 10:21, the primary exchange housing registered a temperature spike that the sensors had not predicted 11 degrees in 90 seconds, which was not within any operational parameter the system had ever recorded. At 10:22, Freed attempted to stabilize the temperature using the standard thermal regulation protocol. At 10:23, the temperature spiked again, 22 degrees. The rate of increase was accelerating. At 10:24, Freed ordered an emergency shutdown. At 10:25, the emergency shutdown failed. The thermal override circuit, which should have killed power to the exchange loop automatically at the threshold temperature, did not engage. The system kept running. The temperature kept climbing. At 10:26, Douglas Freed picked up the phone and called Victoria Hargrove's office. "We have a critical failure in progress," he said. "The thermal override is non-functional. If we don't get manual intervention within the next, 15 minutes, 20, we're looking at a thermal runaway event in a $600 million prototype." He paused. "And possibly structural damage to the platform." He paused again. "Get Calloway back," he said. Victoria made 4 calls in the next 6 minutes. The first was to the dock transport. Ethan was already gone. The second was to platform security, to ask whether anyone had a contact number for Calloway beyond what was in the HR system. The third was to Marcus, who was already in the engine hall. The fourth call she didn't make. Someone made it for her. At some point in the preceding 7 months, At some point before Ethan Calloway had taken a job as a Class B maintenance technician at a Gulf Coast contractor platform, under a quietly modified credential file, someone in the Department of the Navy's Special Projects Directorate had attached a silent monitoring flag to the Delphi system's critical failure alerts. It was the kind of flag that generated no visible notification in the standard chain of command. It simply, when triggered, routed an encrypted signal to a specific office at Naval Station Pensacola. At 10:27, that flag triggered. At 10:31, 3 HH-60H Seahawk helicopters lifted off from Naval Station Pensacola. They flew south-southeast at maximum cruise speed. At 10:47, they appeared over the Gulf, 12 miles out, coming in fast and low. On the platform, the sound of the rotors arrived before anything was visible, a deep, rhythmic pulse that rolled across the water and reached CP-7 roughly 90 seconds before the aircraft themselves. Workers on the main deck heard it and looked up, then looked at each other. Victoria heard it from inside the engine hall, where she had been standing for the past 12 minutes, watching Douglas Freed and his team attempt to manually contain a thermal escalation that was, by this point, no longer containable by anything they knew how to do. She walked out onto the main deck. 3 Seahawks came in from the south, tight formation, descending in a controlled arc that put them directly over the platform's landing pad. A yellow outlined square on the aft deck that had been used exactly twice in the 18-month CP-7 had been operational. They landed in sequence, rotors still turning, and before the dust settled, the doors were open. Men in flight suits moved quickly across the deck, and then, from the lead aircraft, stepped a figure in a Navy uniform with the insignia of a rear admiral on his collar. He was in his late 50s, gray at the temples, with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of authority in compressed spaces. His name was Rear Admiral Charles Merritt. He did not extend his hand to Victoria when she reached him. He did not introduce himself. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. "Where is the mechanic?" he said. The question hung in the salt air. "I'm sorry?" Victoria said. "The maintenance technician who flagged the thermal anomaly this morning," Merritt said. "Ethan Calloway." "Where is he?" Something shifted in Victoria's chest. A small, uncomfortable reorganization of certainties. I released him from duty this morning." "You terminated him?" "Yes." Merritt looked at her for another second. Then he turned to the officer beside him, a commander with a tablet in her hand. "Get him on the phone." "Now." "Sir, we have a direct line established with his personal device. He's currently—" She checked the tablet. 11 miles northeast. "On the highway. Get him back here," Merritt said. "Whatever it takes." He turned back to Victoria. "In the meantime," he said, "nobody touches anything in that engine hall. Nothing. Do you understand me? Admiral, with respect, we have a thermal escalation in progress." "I know exactly what you have in progress," Merritt said. "That's why I'm here." He paused. "Do not touch anything." He walked past her toward the engine hall. Victoria stood on the deck with the wind in her face, and the rotors still spinning down behind her, and the weight of something she hadn't understood until 30 seconds ago settling across her shoulders. She had fired the man who built the engine. Ethan was 2 miles past the shore causeway when his personal phone rang, not the work phone that had been surrendered at the dock. His personal phone. The number that appeared on the screen was not in his contacts. It was a 850 area code. "Pensacola," he answered. "Mr. Calloway." A woman's voice. Precise. Professional. "This is Commander Elise Farrow, Naval Station Pensacola. Admiral Merritt requests your immediate return to CP-7. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Is the system still running?" he said. "Yes." "Has anyone touched the thermal override circuit?" "I don't have specifics on." "Find out," he said. "I need to know before I decide anything." A pause. The line went quiet. He could hear, distantly, the sound of voices in a room. Farrow came back. Mr. Freed attempted a manual activation of the thermal override at 10:22. It failed to engage. "Okay," Ethan said. "Mr. Calloway, give me 20 minutes, he said. "Sir, the system." "I know what the system is doing," he said. It's been doing it since 7 a.m. Give me 20 minutes. He paused. Tell the Admiral, nobody touches the primary exchange housing until I'm in the room. And tell Miss Hargrove she can observe, but she does not speak. He ended the call. In the passenger seat, Lily looked up from her book. That was fast, she said. Change of plans, he said again. They asked you to come back? Yes. She thought about this. Did they ask nicely? He glanced at her. Not especially, he said. She nodded slowly. Are you going to go? He was already turning around. The dock transport was waiting at the shore terminal when Ethan pulled up not the standard passenger tender, but a rigid hull inflatable, with a Navy rating at the helm and a second officer standing in the bow, life vests ready. Ethan got out of the truck. He opened the back seat, pulled out a worn canvas bag that he kept there, and slung it over one shoulder. Lily got out too. You can't come, he said. I know. She looked at the boat. Is it going to be bad? Probably messy, he said. Not bad. What's the difference? Bad is when you can't fix it, he said. Messy is when you can, but it takes a while and you get your hands dirty. She seemed to accept this. She climbed back into the truck. Then she stopped, half in, and looked at him over her shoulder. Dad, she said, don't let them talk to you the way she did this morning. He looked at her. I won't, he said. She nodded. She got back in and picked up her book. He walked down to the dock. The inflatable made the crossing in 11 minutes. By the time Ethan stepped back onto CP-7's main deck, the Seahawks had fully shut down, and a perimeter had been established around the engine hall Navy personnel at each access point, nobody in or out without authorization. Victoria Hargrove was standing near the central equipment storage bay. She had her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she was doing the thing people do when they're trying very hard not to look like they've lost control of a situation, which is to stand very still and look directly at the thing they can't control. When she saw Ethan walking across the deck, something happened to her face. It was brief, and she contained it quickly. But it was there. He stopped in front of her. She opened her mouth. He said, not now. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't dismissive, exactly. It was the tone of a man who had a limited amount of time and no interest in using it on the wrong thing. He kept walking. Victoria stood still. Marcus, standing beside her, said nothing. Inside the engine hall, Rear Admiral Merritt was standing near the main monitoring panel with two of his officers and Douglas Freed, who looked like a man who had aged 5 years in the past hour. The sound in the room was substantial now, a deep, oscillating pressure that you felt in your molars. Merritt turned when Ethan entered. They looked at each other. Charlie, Ethan said. Ethan, Merritt said. You look like a mechanic. I was one, this morning, Ethan said. I'm not sure what I am now. You're the man who's going to keep this thing from burning through the deck, Merritt said. That's all I care about at the moment. Ethan set his bag down and walked directly to the primary exchange, housing a 2-story column of insulated steel at the center of the hall, currently emitting heat in visible waves that bent the air around it. He put his hand flat against the casing. 1 second. 2. What's the current temperature reading on the exchange loop? He said. One of the officers read from a tablet. 412 degrees Fahrenheit. Climbing approximately 8 degrees per minute. How long has it been climbing? 47 minutes at an accelerating rate. Ethan nodded. He walked around the housing in a slow circle, his head tilted slightly, listening. He stopped at the northeast quadrant. He crouched down and looked at the base of the housing, where the primary coupling connected to the floor-mounted thermal dissipation grid. He reached into his bag. What happened next was, in technical terms, a series of specific, measured interventions in a complex thermoelectric system. In human terms, it was something else. It was the particular silence that falls over a room when everyone in it realizes they're watching someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Ethan worked without speaking. He opened his bag and removed, one by one, a series of instruments that were not standard issue, a custom calibration tool with a worn wooden handle, a pressure gauge with handwritten scale markings, a small device about the size of a television remote that nobody in the room could identify. He connected the pressure gauge to a port on the northeast face of the housing that wasn't listed on the standard schematic diagram. Because it wasn't on the standard schematic, because he had added it during the original installation and had never entered it into the official documentation, a detail that now, in this moment, explained a great deal about who he was. The gauge reading was different from what the main system was showing. Very different. "What is that?" Freed asked. "Secondary pressure tap," Ethan said. "I installed it during Phase 1. It reads the thermal differential across the exchange membrane before the main sensors normalize the data." He looked at the gauge. "The membrane is delaminating. It's been delaminating for about 6 months. Slowly enough that the standard sensors never caught it because their calibration range treats that deviation as noise." Silence. "The thermal override failed," he continued, "because the override circuit's activation sensor is mounted downstream of the delaminating section. It's reading the normalized output, not the actual thermal load." He paused. "The system thinks it's fine." "It isn't fine." Freed put his hand over his mouth. "Can you stop it?" Merritt said. "I need to manually isolate the exchange membrane and reroute thermal dissipation to the secondary grid," Ethan said. "It'll drop the system output to about 30% of capacity, but it'll stop the escalation. Will that damage the prototype?" "Less than the alternative." Merritt nodded once. Ethan reached into his bag again. For the next 22 minutes, nobody in the engine hall spoke, unless Ethan asked them a direct question. He moved around the housing with the deliberate economy of someone who had designed the system he was now repairing because he had. He knew where every coupling was, where every valve seat, where every access point existed in this machine, including the ones that weren't on any drawing that anyone in this room had ever seen. He opened a panel on the south face of the housing, a panel that had been painted over at some point in the past year, the paint slightly different in color from the surrounding surface, as though someone had wanted it to be less visible. He looked at what was behind it. He was quiet for a moment. "Douglas," he said. Freed stepped forward. Ethan pointed to the interior of the panel. Freed looked. His expression went from tense to something harder. "That relay circuit," Ethan said. "Is that how it was when you ran the Phase 2 system check?" Freed looked at him. "That circuit wasn't in any configuration I've ever seen." "No," Ethan said. "It wasn't." He looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at the circuit. "How long has that been there?" "Based on the paint," Ethan said, "at least 6 months. Possibly more." He paused. "It's wired to bypass the thermal override under specific load conditions, the conditions that were created this morning when Freed ran the manual override check." The room was very quiet. "Someone installed a circuit to make the override fail," Merritt said. "Yes," Ethan said. "When the system was under stress." "Yes. Deliberately. That's how circuits get installed," Ethan said. "They don't install themselves." He isolated the delaminating membrane. He rerouted dissipation to the secondary grid using the custom tool with the worn wooden handle, working through 3 access ports in a sequence that only he knew. He disconnected the bypass circuit with careful, gloved hands and sealed it in an evidence bag that Commander Farrow produced from somewhere. At 11:44, 17 minutes after Ethan had entered the engine hall, the temperature reading on the primary exchange loop began to fall. 8 degrees per minute down, then 12. Then leveling, the sound in the room changed. The deep, oscillating pressure diminished, degree by degree, and was replaced by the clean, even hum of a system running within its actual parameters. Nobody cheered, nobody said anything. The engine hall was quiet except for the machinery. Ethan stood up from where he'd been crouching, pulled off his gloves, and put them in his bag. He looked at the monitoring panel. All readings nominal, genuinely this time. He looked at Freed, whose eyes were red at the corners. "Thank you," Freed said. Ethan nodded. He picked up his bag. Admiral Merritt took Victoria Hargrove into a conference room adjacent to the engine hall, while Ethan sat in a chair outside the door and drank the coffee that Commander Farrow had gotten him from somewhere. It was bad coffee. He drank it anyway. Through the door, he could hear the tone of the conversation more than the words. Merritt's voice steady and measured. Victoria's voice starting hard and going softer as the conversation progressed. After 35 minutes, the door opened. Victoria came out. She looked different than she had that morning. Not diminished. Exactly. She was still the same person. Still the same precise and driven presence. But something in the architecture of her posture had changed. Some load-bearing assumption had been removed and she was redistributing weight. She looked at Ethan. He looked at her. "Your name isn't really Calloway," she said. "Calloway is my mother's maiden name," he said. "I use it sometimes." "Your full name is Ethan Harrington Solis," she said. "You have a doctorate in thermoelectric systems engineering from MIT. You were the lead architect of the Delphi propulsion system from 2016 to 2021. You designed the engine that I've spent the past 4 months treating as an inheritance." She paused. "You left the project 3 years ago." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at his coffee cup. "My wife was sick," he said. "She died 14 months after I left. Pancreatic cancer. I wanted to be home." He paused. "When I left, I was told the project was being handed to a new technical lead. What actually happened was that the new technical lead was supervised by an operations manager named Gerald Harp, who I now believe has spent the past 3 years selectively concealing design vulnerabilities from the DoD audit process." Victoria was very still. "Gerald Harp," she said. "He reported to your father." She looked at the wall behind Ethan's head. "Gerald Harp," she said again, very quietly, "has been on the management team for 11 years. "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. "The bypass circuit," she said, "that was installed to create a controllable failure event," Ethan said. "My guess, and Merritt's team will determine this more precisely, is that Harp has been managing the discovery of these vulnerabilities strategically, surfacing them at moments that extend the contract timeline. Each time there's a near failure, the DoD has to authorize additional investigation and remediation resources. It's a very slow way to steal from a government contract, and if the system had actually failed today, thermal runaway in a closed-loop thermoelectric prototype on an offshore platform," Ethan said. "The explosion would have been significant. The investigation would have taken years." Victoria closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "You came back here 7 months ago," she said. "Under a false identity. You were watching the system. I designed it," he said. "I knew it had vulnerabilities I hadn't been given time to fully address before I left. I wanted to know if anyone was managing them honestly. And instead you found Gerald Harp." "I found Gerald Harp," he said. She looked at him. There was something in her expression that wasn't easy to categorize. Not guilt, exactly, and not apology, though it contained elements of both. It was more like the look of a person who has just recalculated the distance they thought they understood, and found it was very different from what they thought. "This morning," she said. "Yes. I called you replaceable. You didn't know who I was. That doesn't," she stopped. Started again. "It doesn't matter whether I knew. What I said was wrong regardless." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. She didn't apologize dramatically. There was no scene of it, no collapse. Victoria Hargrove was not, in any version of herself, a person who made public spectacles of contrition. What she did was this. She went back into the conference room with Admiral Merritt. She was in there for another 20 minutes. When she came out, she had a legal pad with handwritten notes and the look of someone who had just made several irreversible decisions. She called Marcus into a side office. Ethan could see them through the office window, not hear, just see. Marcus's face going from carefully neutral to something more complicated as the conversation progressed. At one point, he nodded several times in quick succession, the nod of a man who is relieved to be given clear instructions after a long period of unclear ones. 40 minutes later, Gerald Harp, who had been on the platform all morning, moving through the crisis at a careful distance, watching without contributing, was escorted by 2 Navy personnel from his office to the conference room, where Admiral Merritt's officers were waiting for him with a recording device and a set of documents that he would spend the next 4 hours reading and then refusing to sign. That was the Navy's problem. Not Victoria's. Not Ethan's. Late afternoon, the Gulf had gone from gray to a flat, burnished gold, and the platform threw long shadows east across the water. Ethan was on the main deck, leaning against the railing, watching the light change. Victoria found him there. She stood next to him. Not close, 2 feet of space between them. Both of them looking at the water. "The Admiral told me something," she said. "He tells people things. He said you were offered a senior position at the DoD's Naval Systems Directorate when you left the project. You turned it down. My daughter needed a father who was home," he said. "He also said you've been consulting informally for the past 3 years on 4 different propulsion projects, off the books, for nothing." "I like engines," Ethan said. "That's not an explanation. It's the only one I have," he said. "Some people play golf. I fix engines." She was quiet. The water moved. "I want to offer you a role," she said. "Not as a technician. As Chief Technical Advisor for the Delphi project, you'd have full system access, full documentation authority, and a compensation structure that reflects your actual contribution rather than a Class B certification." He didn't answer immediately. "I'm not interested in a title," he said. "I know. Or in reporting to a management chain that doesn't understand what it's managing." "I know that too," she said. "What I'm offering isn't a job in the way you're thinking of it. I want the system to be safe. I want the project to be honest, and I can't make it either of those things without someone who actually understands it." She paused. "That's you. Whether you want it to be or not." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the water. "My terms," he said. "Your terms," she agreed. "Within reason. My daughter gets to come to the platform twice a month." Victoria blinked. That was not the term she'd been expecting. "She likes helicopters," Ethan said. "And she's never seen the Gulf from out here." Something moved across Victoria's face. It might have been, if you were watching carefully, the beginning of something she hadn't expected to feel in this conversation. "That's a very easy term," she said. "I don't make things complicated," he said. "No," she agreed. "You don't." She extended her hand. He looked at it for a moment. Then he shook it. Gerald Harp was removed from the platform that evening under escort, and subsequently cooperated with federal investigators in a process that took 8 months and eventually implicated 2 additional members of the Hargrove Systems Financial Oversight Team. The Delphi project was placed under enhanced DoD audit supervision for 6 months, during which every system parameter, including 17 undocumented design features that existed only in Ethan's original engineering notebooks, was formally cataloged and incorporated into the official technical record. Douglas Freed requested a meeting with Ethan 2 weeks after the incident. He came in the morning with coffee and sat down and said, plainly, "I should have listened when you flagged it. I'm sorry I didn't." Ethan said, "You didn't have context." Freed said, "I had enough context to notice a warning. I chose not to." Ethan considered this. "Okay," he said. "Don't do it again." They worked well together after that. Victoria Hargrove spent the 6 months following the incident doing, quietly and persistently, the thing she probably should have started doing the moment she took over the project. Learning the system, not learning about it, actually learning it. From first principles, starting with Ethan's original design notebooks, which he gave her access to without ceremony and without making a thing of the gesture. She was a fast study. She had always been a fast study. The difference, now, was that she knew what she didn't know, which is the prerequisite for learning anything real. She still walked fast. She still had a voice that cut through noise. But she had added something, a habit of pausing before decisions that touched the technical core of the project, and asking, "Who knows more about this than I do? And have I talked to them?" It changed the project. Not overnight, and not without friction, but it changed. Ethan did not move back to shore. He stayed on the platform during the week, in one of the technician quarters near the engine hall, a small room with a view of the water and a shelf where he kept his daughter's drawings. On weekends he drove home, and on the first and third Saturday of each month, Lily came out to the platform on the regular personnel tender, with her backpack and her book and her particular talent for going very still, in the presence of something she found interesting. She found the engine hall interesting. She found the propulsion system Once Ethan began explaining it to her in the specific way he had of breaking complex things into their essential logic, extraordinarily interesting. She made a friend of Amber Walsh, the junior technician who had been the first to notice the oscillation on the morning of the incident. Amber was 24 and patient with questions, which Lily had many of. On the third Saturday of the second month, Lily drew a picture of the Delphi system's thermal exchange loop, freehand, from memory, in colored pencil, with the pressure differential correctly illustrated, and pinned it to the main bulletin board in the engine hall. Douglas Freed looked at it for a long time. Then he asked Amber who drew it. Amber pointed. Freed walked over to where Lily was standing at the railing, watching a freighter move slowly south along the horizon. "That drawing," he said. "On the board." She looked up. "You did that from memory?" he said. "Dad explained it 3 times, she said. The third time I understood it." Freed was quiet for a moment. "You got the pressure differential right. Most of my team couldn't draw that correctly without a reference." She seemed neither proud nor modest about this. She seemed, instead, to find it simply interesting, the way she found most things simply interesting. "Dad says if you understand something well enough," she said, "you can draw it without looking." Freed nodded slowly. "Your dad is right. About a lot of things." "I know," she said. "He's annoying about it sometimes." Freed laughed. It was the first time he'd laughed in the engine hall since before the incident, and it surprised him. On a Tuesday afternoon in November, 3 months after the incident, Ethan was alone in the engine hall, not working, just sitting on the floor near the primary exchange housing, his back against the wall, a cup of coffee going cold beside him. The system was running clean. Every reading nominal, genuinely. The restored thermal loop moved heat through its circuit, with the smooth, purposeful efficiency of a thing that had been designed well and was, at last, being allowed to do what it was designed to do. The hum was right, not the slightly off-rhythm aberration of that morning months ago. This was the true hum, the sound the system made when everything was as it should be. He sat and listened to it. After a while, he heard footsteps in the corridor, and Lily appeared in the doorway. She had her backpack on and her book in one hand, and she stood in the frame for a moment, looking at him. "Amber said you were in here." "Amber's right." She came in and sat down beside him on the floor, setting her book aside. She looked at the housing. She listened. "It sounds different," she said, "from before." "It's supposed to sound like this," he said. "This is what it actually sounds like when it's healthy." She listened some more. "Is this what you built?" she said. "When you first made it?" "More or less." "It sounds good." "It does," he said. She leaned against his shoulder. "Dad," she said. "Amber told me what happened. The whole thing. Everything from the beginning." He didn't say anything. "She told me you designed it," Lily said. "The whole system." He waited. She said when the helicopters came, the Admiral asked for you by name. "Merritt," he said. "Yes." She said everybody on the platform froze. They were surprised. Lily was quiet for a moment. "Are you important?" she said. He looked down at her. She was looking at the housing, at the clean light on its surface, at the air that was still and cool and no longer bent by heat it shouldn't have been generating. "Only where it matters," he said. She nodded. She picked up her book. He picked up his coffee. The engine hummed. Outside, the Gulf was dark and enormous, and the platform lights laid long gold lines across the water. And somewhere 11 miles north, on a causeway that ran between shore and sea, a truck sat in a parking lot with a booster cushion still strapped to the passenger seat, waiting for the ride home. The Delphi propulsion system completed its Phase 3 technical review 41 days later, 1 day ahead of schedule. It passed. The review panel noted, in their formal documentation, that the system demonstrated exceptional design, integrity, and comprehensive safety architecture, and that the secondary monitoring infrastructure, in particular, showed evidence of unusually thoughtful original engineering. The name of the original architect appeared nowhere in the report. He didn't ask it to.